Well, hello, welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. My guest today is Eleanor Janega. Did I already forget how to say it?
You did it.
Right?
You did it right. That was it.
Yeah. It's amazing that I remembered, considering now it's 2024 and it's been almost a year since we last spoke, and all those world historical events that happened. It's been crazy.
I mean, yeah, who would have seen that the new Prime Minister of the UK is an actual Kraken? But
oh, you can come up with something more elaborate than that. I know think it's more like
that's too plausible.
Who could have seen that there's no longer a United Kingdom? I don't know. I mean, the UK governmental system.
Inshallah,
Yep. So it's been a crazy time, although only a day has passed for us since we recorded the other episode yesterday. But the listeners will be hearing this far, far into the future. So hello from the past. And we are here to talk about debt again, this time the chapter on the Middle Ages.
Yes. It's a good chapter.
Yeah, I'm sure I will have covered this. I should never have brought up the time stuff because now I'm all in my head about it. But I'm sure I will have covered this by this point in the series. But a lot of times when you read reviews of debt or longer discussions, people say the second half of the book is not as good or not that interesting or something. This is a very common response. The last three things I've read about debt have all said that. And it's more like, I think the second half of the book is just messier. More, I don't know what it gets all historical. It really is. The second half of the book is a history of the entire world, or I should say the entire world, except for, the parts that the Europeans and the Asians and the Africans, I guess it's the entire world from Asia to Europe. I don't remember as much about Africa, and definitely not what is now the Americas. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, from a Middle Ages perspective, oftentimes when we talk about the Middle Ages, even if we say the term global Middle Ages, a lot of the time what we're talking about is what we always say Afro-Eurasia.
Yeah.
Right.
Afro-Eurasia.
And that's often to do with written sources.
Yeah.
Because for all sorts of reasons, which isn't to say that some cultures in the Americas didn't have written sources, or indeed I've got a mate, Alex West, who works on medieval Indonesia. I mean, it wasn't Indonesia at the time. And they have written sources, but the trouble is they are in a fucking jungle and they often were writing on banana leaves. So they just rot. Right. Yeah. Like there are a lot fewer sources to work with. So there's like these environmental reasons why we lose sources oftentimes from this. But like Afro-Eurasia as a concept at this time before, if you're going to talk about debt, works really well as well, because it's within here that our conception of debt takes over the world as a result of colonialism and imperialism in the modern period. So, this is where it's kind of being framed and where it's being brought together. And I can see why people think that this is messy. And I mean, it's kind of messy because, it's really hard to write a history of the entire world. I don't know. It's hard to write a history of the Middle Ages, right? Like point blank, because it's like, oh, well, what do I do with this 1100 years, right? And then if you're trying to do 5,000 years and you're trying to do, everywhere, that's tough. Indeed, a thing that I would also say is, he gets a couple things sort of wrong, but, in a way that I expect non-experts to get things wrong. Like my man is talking about witch trials in medieval Europe. And I'm like, no, that's not a thing that happened, but that's okay. That's a myth, and it gets in there, and I understand it, but that's a modern problem, honey. Let's not blame medieval people for our bullshit, but yeah.
Yeah, I can't call to mind any examples firsthand right now, but there are definitely times with the stuff that I know really well in the 19th century where Graeber says something and I'm just like, ooh, no, that's completely wrong. But I want to say I am all for this kind of giant book that covers everything. We scholars have gotten really good at writing little books, and I'm not against these books that cover something small in a really interesting way, and those books are truer than the big books in some way, but also they're falser than the big books in another way because they don't connect to everything in a way that Graeber connects everything, which makes it almost a paranoid project connecting
Oh,
everything.
yeah, I could see that. Yeah, I suppose one of the things that I would say about it too is when you have these big colossus projects, that are really trying to bring everything together. One of the things about that is that it really brings non-experts in. So I kind of feel like when we get really into the nitty-gritty of smaller things, that's academics talking to academics, right? It's like the same seven of us jerking each other off, and like who cares, like it's harder to make an argument for regular ass people why they should care about this one granular thing. Is it possible? Yeah. Like I'm not saying that it isn't, and I don't think these projects aren't worthwhile, but if what you're attempting to do is kind of really shape the way we as a society are talking about something or thinking about it, I think like aim for the backfield, like you this is where you're going with it. You got to like swing hard and go for it. That's how I feel.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the other peril is, though, and I do not think Graeber has this problem because he's out there overturning received wisdom in the big picture. Although you're right, like something like the witches, he does have the problem. Is a lot of times these big books, and in some ways, the dawn of everything was written against these big books, that
Mm,
they get it precisely wrong because they are telling the story that everyone knows already. And I
mm.
find it often the case that the story everyone knows is often the exact opposite of the story. I forgot. So I'm not the right person to ask about this. What's the name of the council that the Catholics did to respond to the Reformation, and then they created
A
the
Council
Counter
of Trent.
Reformation?
The
Council of
Council of
Trent.
Trent.
Yeah. So Jesus, I'm going to blow this again. There's a guy who I used extensively in my dissertation. I'm blanking on his name, whatever. His argument is that what happened at the Council of Trent, like the actual council and what they
Mm,
decided, and then the policies that were enacted by the Catholic Church after the Council of Trent are basically precisely opposite. So we say like
mm.
the Council of Trent did this, and it's like, well, yeah, yes and no. If you mean the group of people who had a council at Trent, then no, they
Yeah,
didn't do that at all.
like I hate to be a historian, but define your terms. Like, who are we calling the Council of Trent? It's
Yeah,
like the people who enact things from the Council of Trent are not necessarily the Council of Trent. And we gotta be real about that. So yeah, it's stuff like that. And however, having said that, I don't think that it's bad to be a little bit messy. I think it's really hard writing books like this, but I do think that it is disappointing when we're reading a work that is supposed to be about challenging perceived wisdom, and then it's like, oh, look, it's some perceived wisdom.
yeah,
But it's like that's in the air we breathe. Like I can't get too mad about it because like I would just be angry all the time if I got
yeah,
completely out of control every time something got wrong about the Middle Ages. Right? Like
yeah.
that's just
Yeah.
life. So fine.
Yeah, no, it's inevitable. And I like to compare Graeber to Foucault in the sense of like he's got this story of this time period that's really interesting and compelling and tells us how we got to where we are. And then it just can inspire 1,000 dissertations of
Mm,
people who can dig deeper and say, well, this works in the broad strokes, or actually, I want to overturn completely what he said. And it's like an opening up, to use a
mm,
Foucauldian term, of like a field of discourse. And I think we'll know in 50 years that Graeber has opened up a field of discourse,
yeah.
and people will just be taking the examples of debt and writing dissertations about them, and then other people will be picking those up and responding to them for a while.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I
so
think
let's
that's
get to the. Sorry, go ahead.
I just think that's really useful. I think that in many ways, one's legacy as a scholar, isn't that, what we're all aiming for, you know? Mm.
Yeah,
I'm just thinking about how great he is. So I'm just
yeah. Well,
spacing out thinking about how much I love David Graeber.
yeah. Well, it's me too. But it's also good for us to note the stuff that he got wrong, because
Yeah.
I do think that's inevitable, and I am such a Graeber fanboy that I want to have some credibility that I do know that not everything he said was 100% accurate. Although everything he said about Jobs was 100% accurate. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong
Completely. Yeah.
there.
Well, this is just what happens when we stray outside of like our exact fields, right? And that's fair enough. I don't mind. I'm not mad about it, right? And starting it, one of the things that I really love to see, he's got this great Aquinas quote right at the top, where my man says, "Artificial wealth comprises the things which of themselves satisfy no natural need. For example, money, which is a human contrivance." And I'm like, yes,
Yes.
yes, yes. My man said it. Like, and I've got such a love-hate relationship with Thomas Aquinas, because he's so wrong on so many things that I feel very strongly about. But he has absolutely hit the nail on the head with this one. This idea about being like, but you don't need that, right? Like, where this is, you're just getting to absolutely weird levels with it now. This is just something that humans have made up. It's not natural. And I think that naturalness here is a really interesting concept, right? Because this is for medieval Europeans, right? Like, especially within Christendom. Naturalness is kind of like also a way of thinking or talking about the divine, right? So natural things, because they are created by God, are necessarily kind of good, and they are seen as being in balance with the divine and emanating from the divine, right? So this is kind of like a way of saying that in terms of like human creations, at times they're necessarily fallible because of the fall of man and original sin. And so when he says a human contrivance here, he's like, this is the result of sin. Like, if you want a bunch of like wealth, that like for the sake of wealth, like, you have to understand that this is sinful. It just is. And like, you can dress it up all you want to, but that is kind of like getting to the heart of it. I think it's such a powerful way of starting this off.
Yeah, and I want to jump in and just say this is where the medieval philosophers find Plato so
Mm,
useful, because he really has this theory. I mean, it's kind of weird, but you can just sort of take the forms and put God there, and it works for the Christians. And so
yeah.
if you're going further and further away from that real thing, which we can call God or nature or whatever, you're getting worse and worse, and you're making a copy of a copy of a copy. And
Mm,
so it seems like debt instruments and the creation of massive wealth is taking us further and further from this thing that we're supposed to be getting at: truth,
yeah.
God, justice, nature, whatever. And I
Hmm.
tend to view Plato as the worst, but this is also, I think, the
Real
way
talk.
Aquinas, we can put Plato and I mean, I kind of view Aquinas as one of the worst, but this is a case where
Oh
Plato
yeah.
and Aquinas are valuable in terms of like, no, look at what you've done. You've made up this thing
Hmm.
called debt, called money, called wealth, and it's pulling you away from what you're actually supposed to be doing if you're going to be a
Yeah.
good medieval person.
Yeah, and I fundamentally, to be clear, disagree with what Plato, with Aristotle, with what with Aquinas think that a good person, quote unquote, should be doing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think that they're wrong on that. However, I do agree with them on this one thing, which is like, yeah, but you can't be doing a good thing if you're dealing in debt. It cannot be good by nature of what it means, in the meaning of it, and just kind of like wallowing in the suffering of others for the sake of nothing, really can't be possible. It's like how you know I get annoyed when people stand billionaires, because I'm like, you can't earn $1 billion, right? Like, you steal it, right? You steal $1 billion from other people. It's that same kind of thing where it's like, by the time you get to the like levels of wealth, there's no way to have done it in a moral way. It can't happen. Right. Like, and Aquinas is bang on about that. Do I agree with him on sexuality at all whatsoever? No. I just want to make that clear. Spend all my time being like, oh, shut up. How would you know? But he's right. When you're right, you're right. All right.
Yeah.
We'll say that.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. It does pain me to say Aquinas or Plato are right about anything, but I've done it now. It's on
Mm,
record. What's
mm,
done is done. Thank you for all of the disclaimers and provisos. That's helpful.
mm,
So when we talk about the Middle Ages, and we can talk about the global Middle Ages or the Afro-Eurasian Middle Ages,
mm,
I guess I first want to ask you about, there's sort of a broad sweep, a very, very broad sweep in this book that, like, basically the argument is, and I am so I mean, no one is really qualified to judge this claim. You are
Mm,
more qualified to judge than I am. But the sweep is basically, these things happen, it's debt and empire, and it takes over everywhere, everywhere in quote, the world. And he calls
mm,
this the axial age. I know that term from Mumford. I think it comes from even earlier than Mumford, but that sort of thing. And then the
mm,
argument goes that this thing that we call the Middle Ages, because it's between the great period of empires and
mm,
our modern age,
mm.
is dark. Maybe from a if you're looking for empires, it's kind of
Yeah.
dark. If you're looking for the lives of common people, it might be less dark. But he says
Mm,
it's real. He says it's a real thing. Things
yeah.
did change, and they changed everywhere for about 1,000 years. And that's such a broad claim. That's why I was like, shit, I don't know anything about what's happening in China.
Well, I think where what he really gets right, and why I'm kind of inclined to go with him, is like I do think that there is a substantial change from I suppose what I would call the antique period, as a Europeanist, to the Middle Ages. And he gets right the thing that absolutely drives me up a goddamn wall constantly. Or he says right on the first page of the chapter. For most of the Earth's inhabitants, it could only be seen as an extraordinary improvement over the terrors of the axial age. And I'm like, yes,
Yes.
yes, thank you. And this is something that that confuses people, right? Because so the beginning of the Middle Ages, in this way, you see it as the collapse of empires, right? So the collapse of the older empires, and we have been trained very thoroughly by the imperialist project that we're living in now to think that the collapse of empires is a bad thing. Right? Like there's so much effort put into like assuring everyone that, oh no, 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 you would have so much rather lived under Rome. It would have been so much better to be enslaved in Rome than to be a free person like in one of the Frankish kingdoms. Why? And I talked about this in the first episode. We're trained to kind of think that if there's consumer products, then it's better. And if there's a Colosseum, it's better. And that, I'm sorry, but there's just absolutely no way to argue that for common people. I don't think. Sure, like I think that things probably got a little more annoying for rich people, right? Like if you're the guy who owns all the enslaved people, I'm sure things were like less fun for you. Like when people are like, oh, well, Romans had underfloor heating. Which fucking Romans?
Yeah.
Right? Which fucking Romans? That would be like saying now, like after society collapse, and saying, "Oh well, everyone in the 21st century had private jets." No, we didn't. No, we don't.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah,
no, we don't.
there were private jets, but
Yeah. Oh wow. And then everything collapsed and it got worse because there weren't any private jets anymore. Well, not everybody has fucking private jets, right? You're looking at like the top echelons of these empires because that's who writes the sources and that's how source survival works, right? Like you have to have room and money to store sources. And this is an actual physical reality, a material reality about the way that history works is that, the study of history and what makes it history as opposed to archaeology is that we're like, well, what did they write down? And then we interpret it, right? So we need some stuff that got written down and it needs to be saved. And now the thing about medieval people in Europe in particular is that they are very, very interested in saving Roman things because part of the way that they justify their own power is by saying that they are a new iteration of Rome. And that's like a big deal for them. So there is a real emphasis placed on the continuity of these libraries and keeping these things alive. When they start copying texts, a lot of the time they go straight to Plato. They go straight to Aristotle. They're like, these are the things that you need, right? And they care less about their own stuff and more about history, right? And similarly, the empires in Asia are very bureaucratic, right? And even when we see, for example, in China, and he gets to the heart of this, a collapse of one empire, we see the maintenance of the Confucian system, of the kind of the scholar diplomat system about being like you can go take the diplomacy test and then you can work for the government, and in theory it's egalitarian, but in practice who's got
Yeah,
time to study, right?
yeah.
um
The meritocracy remains with us.
exactly, and they are very good at keeping records and things like that, so we know tons about these empires, and in Europe we know a little bit less, but it's just a function of source survival and how things work. But I would agree that what you tend to see kind of across Afro-Eurasia at this time is collapse of old systems. And now, like, for example, in Northern Africa, one of the big things that you see is, the collapse of, for example, the Eastern Roman Empire ruling things, and certainly the Western Roman Empire. You see, like, the rise of Islam. And there, interestingly, you see kind of like the sudden cooperation of native peoples in terms of being like, no, well, we're doing our own thing, and like an outside empire isn't going to do it. I'm sorry, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's a good thing, right? Like, why are some Greeks here pushing everybody around on the Arabian Peninsula? Shut up. Like, that's not better, right? And I think that certainly in a European context, I'd rather be a serf than fully enslaved. Let's just put it that way, right? So, hey, that's just my 2 cents on the matter. So I think that that is the most profound thing that I would like people to get about the Middle Ages in terms of a sweep of history. And I think that also these debates that you do see about the nature of debt and what it means are one of these hallmarks of how actually there's some good stuff going on. There's some good thought happening in the Middle Ages in ways that are really bolstered by this fracturing and these ways of seeing the world.
Yeah, I think something that I, wasn't thinking of when I started this, and I'm embarrassed, is when I was thinking, Afro-Eurasia, I wasn't thinking about the fact that, Rome is mostly not in what we would now call Europe. And I need to just stress this to people. What we now call Europe is a pretty recent thing. They start using it in the 19th century, really. And you can go back and look at those maps that say Europa or whatever. But what they meant was, the other thing that wasn't Europe was the thing that is now Turkey. And if you look at this entity that that these so-called Europeans, they would not have called themselves Europeans in 700. That's ridiculous. Or 1200. I mean, it's not even the Renaissance. Are they Europeans?
No.
So what you've got is the Roman world, which starts in Rome. And remember, Italy, guys, it's pretty close to Africa. And it runs along the coast of the Mediterranean. So if Europe ends when you get to Turkey and Arabia and everything, then Rome is mostly not European. And that is just, Charlemagne did such a good job of convincing us that Germany is part of Europe, which was Roman, which is not really true, but I can't hold that idea in my head very well because I was so trained.
Yeah, it's so funny because, really the money for Rome is all African. Egypt is the number one place where taxation comes from for the Roman Empire. And, I keep talking about Tunisia because Tunisia is also kind of like number two. And so this is also part of the reason when you have the quote unquote collapse of the Western Roman Empire, which, I don't believe in, but which that's not real. But you see over in the Eastern Roman Empire, which some people would call Byzantium, they are able to keep going in much as they have been doing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years hence, because they continue to control Egypt, until, and then there's Muslim conquest and they lose it and stuff. But their tax base is much richer than Western Rome because Romanness really isn't European almost at all whatsoever. They do some wild stuff. Like they come up here to Britain for some reason. Looking for stuff.
I think it's just the story I've heard is that Claudius wanted to conquer something and he was like, fuck, there's something, let's conquer it. And people are like, that doesn't really count anything, Claudius. And he's like, how dare you? This island's really important. It totally matters.
And it's so funny too, because like the way that people think about Rome or the way that they talk about Rome, as this kind of like world strutting colossus, which it's certainly, like it's a violent empire that was pretty good at taking over places. Couldn't conquer Germania. And even if they had, I don't know what they would have done because they were too stupid. They couldn't even come up with like the heavy plow. They were like, oh, the soil's too thick. Oh, my enslaved people can't make a vineyard. I'm here to shut up. Shut up, Romans. Hate them. I hate Romans. Sorry, this is Roman hate hour. Hate,
Well,
hate, hate, hate.
well, I think the way, and this doesn't tie as much into Graeber, but gets to some of the stuff I'm interested in with the Middle Ages and Kropotkin and everything, is like
Mm,
during these Dark Ages, Kropotkin stresses this over and over again. They invented a ton of great stuff, like
mhm.
plows and eyeglasses
The
and
three-field
everything.
system, and like all like there's a ton of really really great medieval inventions, and people don't think about that because it's part of this imperial propaganda, right?
Yeah,
We have to understand Rome as better. Rome has to be better because we cannot have smaller communities that kind of define what it is that their needs are as being better for
yeah,
individuals. It simply cannot happen, and we can't have innovation happen outside of imperial systems. You have to be like, no, no, no. I'm sorry. You have to be doing violence somewhere in order to make an invention, right? Like the imperial core has to be safe, but then violence has to be happening over there in order for you to invent. And then if that doesn't exist, what do you do? Even these stories like, which unfortunately Graeber falls into this trap, with talking about like the witch hunts. You have to have like people being completely illogical. That has to be a highlight of it. Middle People in the Middle Ages didn't have fucking witch hunts. The Romans did. The Romans killed thousands upon thousands of witches. Medieval people were like, that witches aren't real. And they get the blame, even though like Romans do it and modern people do it, but they don't. And it's this total invention that we have in order to justify why we have these huge systems of debt, why we take over the entire fucking world, or the idea that like being in Europe, even I often am pushing back. Like if we're talking about global Middle Ages, people will say, oh well, sure, the Dark Ages is real, but what about but not in the Islamic world? And I'm like, look, I'm not trying to do down the Islamic world because yeah, it absolutely whips and they're doing really cool shit, but saying that is a justification for imperial violence in the modern period, being like, oh, we didn't have anything, so we had to get on a ship and steal from someone. No, like no, there was plenty of stuff. Calm down, right? Like and don't get me wrong, I'm team Islamic world. In the Middle Ages, don't like. I mean, if someone was like waved a magic wand and was like, "You're now cursed to live somewhere in the Middle Ages," I'd be like, "Granada, thanks, peace."
yeah,
Like, and it's not even close, right? Like, so and I don't even work on Granada, and I know this to be true, but like, these are all this idea of this particular time being stupid, or indeed the absence of debt in the way that we see it now as an institutional project, being proof of how things are bad, and like that being a reason why you want the Renaissance, right? You want the Renaissance because then wholesale debt and commercial debt is introduced, and then that allows you, quote unquote, to do nice things like buy a homoerotic statue of David, right? And which like, and that's certainly true, but there was plenty of like homoerotic statues going on in the church. It's just kind of like individuals who have instrumentalized debt in order to amass massive wealth can now buy statues. Like, well, how is that better? How's that better for the average person who now often has taken on a bunch of fucking debt, right? Like, it's not better, but this is a story that we really need to tell. Having said that, Graeber does a really good job of kind of pointing out that, oh, you certainly do see debt cropping up, a lot across the period. And this isn't to say that that doesn't exist in Europe, but it certainly exists within the Indian and Chinese contexts as well for this. Um, and like this is the conception of the inexhaustible treasuries
hmm
and perpetual endowments to monasteries. And certainly the church does this as well. So this, for those who are unaware, it's so basically it's like especially if you die, right? You give a certain amount of money to the religious institution of your choice, be it Buddhist or Hindu or Christian, whatever. And so here's this amount of money. That's for you. Hopefully they're also going to like pray for your soul. They're going to say some sutras for you. Hopefully this is going to like get you reincarnated more better, or something like that. Or in the Christian context, some prayers will be said for your soul. So if you're in purgatory, for example, you'll get out faster. Which, to be clear, in the medieval context, purgatory is hell with a timer, not like people think it's like limbo, like it's neither here nor there. Like, no, you're getting tortured. In the medieval context, so it's like you want that, right? So, but in order for something to be a perpetual endowment, or there should be an inexhaustible treasury, that means, of course, that money is being lent out. Right. And that's what the religious institution is doing with it, is they're lending it out and then they're using the interest in order to have the person who says the sutras for you, have the priest who reads the mass, pay for candles. Like, you have no idea how much of this goes on candles. Oh my God. like candles is like the thing in the medieval period, like across Afro-Eurasia, of like where money is going. It's candle. It's like the drill tweet, but for like religious institutions. It's like 100%, $10,000 for candles. But this is kind of like a really interesting one, because also, of course, it sort of it's a direct moral quandary for most of us, because if you really sit down and think about it, it's like, what the fuck is a religious person doing lending money? Right. And I think that's a fair question. I say this as a Vajrayana Buddhist, as a paid up Vajrayana Buddhist. I'm like, like it's questionable, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the medieval church has not survived intact into today, although there's ways it has. I think much more clear is the other institution that Graeber identifies. The other big medieval one is the university. And I think we talked about this a little bit last time we talked, although I can't remember if it was recorded or not. Medieval universities, in terms of their endowments and meaning their endowments to be forever and inexhaustible.
Yeah.
We have that. And this, look, I'm, as we speak, 8 miles away from Duke University. And
Boom.
what is that but a group of people, a family that enslaved who knows how many people in order to poison and give cancer to who knows how many people. And now, Duke medicine is famous. Now, if you need to be treated for the lung cancer that you got from smoking the Duke cigarettes, you can go to Duke, because they have this, inexhaustible endowment. They're using their interest from their endowment to do good things. And this is just bullshit for these two obvious reasons. Is one, they're the ones that did all the bad shit in the first place, and the reason why people need their help is because they destroyed those people's lives. And then two, that endowment in the current debt system we have, which is also the old debt system, is actively destroying people's lives, which takes us back to the moral confusion. Like, isn't it nice that Duke has all this money to do good things with? Well, first of all, they started off with bad things. That's how they got the money. And secondly, as long as you have money that's earning interest, it's actively doing bad shit.
Yeah, there's no way to make money off of interest in a way that's moral. It would be my argument. Like me and Aquinas, we're going down on this one together. And this is an interesting thing too, because when universities get set up in Europe in the medieval period, they appear in different ways. So it's like the very first one is Bologna, and Bologna was started by students. So the students were like, oh yeah. So it's like, it's really interesting, right? So this is the anarchist one, where like the students were like, we're trying to get the best education here. We are going to club together and like, we're going to say, hey guys, like what we need is some good teachers. Does anyone want to come here? Right. And that's how Bologna starts. Paris starts at the behest of the church. And the church is like, what we are going to do is we are going to raise up an army of lawyers for ourselves, and we're going to do it in Paris because it's the biggest city in Europe, and that's where everybody wants to go anyway, and that's how we're going to do it. And then you get Oxford, and Oxford is started because the English were like, we're fancy too, and the king does it, right? And so these are the three different ways of kind of starting it, and I would say that there's three various morality tales in here as well, right? Because you have all of these things start off as a result of this, where it's like, Oxford being incredibly evil, Oxford and Cambridge, like Rhodes, the Rhodes Scholarship and the whole Rhodes thing. It's like, the guy who started Rhodesia, cool guy.
Rhodes, yeah.
Like, nice endowment you got there. right? And people here are like, oh, you can't rename things after well, there was a light genocide, but it was a different time. You mean the 1960s? Like that doesn't seem so fucking different to me, right? But these are the things that kind of precipitate universities in this way. And universities go from being, in the case of the Bologna, a nice little thing. Ooh,
Yeah.
we love Bologna all the time in the world for Bologna, to, a way of instrumentalizing the kind of legal power behind a royal court or the church, right? And a lot of that comes along with that fundamentally, because like who owns all the fucking land, right? Like who owns the town, who owns the series of houses, and what are they doing with it? Usually extracting money from tenants who are unfree at the very least, and lending money, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, this is whenever you find it. I mean, I like to find these places, and the medieval university is one of them. Whenever you find these places that are kind of, and certain medieval towns are like this also, that are kind of based on mutual aid, or kind of
Mm.
anarchistic. I mean, college comes from collegiality. It means
Mhm.
it's non-hierarchical. There's no superiors, and you're like, wow, that's really, really beautiful. And you check back like 50 years later,
It's like,
and it's like,
no.
oh shit.
I was
Like,
like, oh, I've got a fun one. I've got my fun medieval university fact that I like to bring up. You know the term town gown relations?
yes.
It's medieval because to be in a university, you had to be a member of the church, you had to be a member of the clergy, which was a way of, it's kind of like campus police are now, because it's like when university students would like get rowdy and do something bad, you would go to ecclesiastical courts instead of like the regular city court, and they'd be like, don't do it again, so they were walking around in cassocks, which is why they have gowns as opposed to the town. Which is, and it's also why towns hated them, because they'd like run out on their tavern bill, or like
There's
just be,
debt
yeah,
due again.
yeah, debt again, like again, debt, right? Like so, they would do all these things where and then be like, yeah, fuck you, you can't do anything, I'm with the church, right? Which is quite funny, because I like how students don't change.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Well, never mind. I have a feeling that students are slowly changing in our neoliberal, ultra
Mm.
professional world, but I'll save that for
Yeah,
another time.
this is the roundabout how the university is not a factory, which is
Yeah,
yeah, an
yeah.
important one, but doesn't we don't have time for that. So.
So I want to pull back real quick just to mention, in case anyone missed it, the key thing that you mentioned earlier about purgatory, right? Is
Mm.
like, if you went to hell, it was because you didn't have enough money, because you didn't spend enough money when you were
Mm.
alive to alleviate your debt. And then the church endowment gets created because it's like, oh shit, I kept too much of this while I was
Yeah,
alive
yeah.
because I had fun, and now I can give it to these people, and they can spend it on the boring shit like candles, so that
Mhm.
I can go to heaven, because I was just unwilling to spend it where I was supposed to spend it when I was alive.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because a lot is written on this from the church's perspective, where it's like, it's generally agreed that the poor are more virtuous. Like, just kind of,
Uh-oh, there's
but
talk about moral confusion.
yeah, exactly. So it's like it's very, very interesting, because it's like the poor are definitely more virtuous, but however, that is not the class of people from whom like saints derive, or and certainly there is an idea of politeness with the poor, which the poor are not seem to have access to, right? So for example, I think it's really important to consider the conception of sainthood here, because right, if you want to become a saint in the Middle Ages, basically the thing that you need to do is be born rich and give it up, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you have to be Saint Francis of Assisi and be like the party boy, like just be a total fuck boy, go out drinking, and then be like, oh, actually one day, never mind, I'm gonna give it all up, and I am gonna starve myself and wear a hair shirt, and then everyone goes, oh wow, that's really holy. But if you're poor and you're already starving, you can't demonstrate that level of
Yeah.
holiness,
Damn it.
right? So there's like the whole class of people who are not invited to do this, and it's like, if and that's like more open to men. Women are kind of like, if women, the way to do it is like, a big way to do it is be a sex worker and give it all up.
Mm.
But interestingly, there, that it's like a tacit admission that like sex work is one of the ways that women can make a lot of money. And so it's like the giving it all up is like, oh, and then she like gave up the luxury, right? So there's this kind of understanding of the suffering of the poor, right? And understanding that opening oneself up to suffering is a spiritual exercise, and that having money is bad, right? But it's like, how the fuck do you think that poor ended up poor, right? Like they're not poor because like it's literally you're born into it, and then what are you going to do? There's no pulling yourself up by your bootstraps in this system, right? It just is what it is. Um, sure, like you could maybe get hold of more land and plant more crops or something, but like, good luck. So the debt is kind of baked in there already, and instrumentalized in this particular way. So there is all this stuff really kind of centered from the church's standpoint of being like, yeah, you were supposed to give up that money. You were supposed to give that money, like give that money to the poor. That's a huge option as far as they're concerned. Like, that's what you're supposed to do, is like give a bunch of money to the poor and give some of it to the church. And if you didn't do that, if you die rich, you don't fucked up, and you are almost certainly in purgatory at the very least, right?
Yeah, so that's all great. I mean, it does seem like it's the debt. It's just like, oh, if you have a lot of money, then
Mhm.
you sort of owe it to the universe to give it up. Owe it
Yeah,
to the universe, God, Buddha, whoever. But then if you give it up, the universe owes you. Isn't it nice that way? It's just debt again.
it's very interesting, right? And this kind of way of you can kind of pass that on to each other, where it's like, oh yeah, well, God will be like, oh, all right, like, yeah, no, it says here you get out of jail free, right? Um, and it's a thing that comes up in ghost stories a lot too. Debt. There's this medieval ghost story, like a trope that we call the Harlequin hunts. And it's like, a guy will be walking down the road in the middle of the night, and then he sees a big parade of the damned. And the damned are all undergoing ironic tortures, because that's that's what happens. And so they're up from hell, and they're parading around, and then he'll recognize someone and he'll go talk to them. And usually the person is saying, I'm in hell because I fucked someone over as a result of debt, and you need to go to my family and undo this. So there's one, I think the very first one, if I recall correctly, where there's a knight who's saying this, and he's being tortured in hell because a miller was in debt to him, and he took the mill from the miller. And then he's like, and then I made more money off of the mill than the miller ever owed me, and I kept the mill. Right. And he's like, you've got to go find my family and tell them to give the mill back. Like, if you don't give the mill back, I will remain in hell. Right. And so there's this a really interesting moral quandary there. Right. Which is like, you could, in theory, take the mill for as long as it takes to be even on the debt. But, so for example, it would be immoral, and you'd go to hell in a medieval context to foreclose on a house and then flip it. That would be, you would go to hell for that, right? So it's like you can't take something and make more money off of it than the person owed. Like it's not possible, and that's a damnable offense in terms of Christian cosmology. Um, so it shows us two things. It shows us that people certainly are indebted and they're struggling in this particular way, but there's also this pushback against it, saying, well, you shouldn't be doing that. Like the end, so no one is saying here, that, as you see in the introduction, that like, oh, well, someone, you must pay your debts. No one is saying that you shouldn't, but you should only pay that debt. It shouldn't be more on top of what you owe. Right. So, like, if you told, oh my God, if you tell Thomas Aquinas about student debt, he would lose his fucking mind. He would be so upset. It's like, you borrowed money to go to university, and it just keeps getting bigger. What do you mean? Like it's crazy, right?
Yeah, this gets us into the good aspects of the Middle Ages as opposed to our time. That precisely as you say, the people who started the system that we live in now, you can argue it's the Venetian merchants, and they were just
Mhm.
like all the interest all the time. Interest good, making money good, debt good. You don't
Mm,
get this, within the church, and we'll need to talk about probably Jewish usury, but there's also these traditions there's Buddhist traditions and Islamic traditions. There's all sorts of counterbalances.
mm,
Sometimes they get sort of hypocritical, but there's meant to be counterbalances to this instrumentalizing your fellow humans into money. And
mm,
post-Renaissance, except as these traditions remain, except as Buddhism remains, except as certain flavors of Christianity remain, in their sort of classical mode, you get rid of these counterbalances, and you even get something like the gospel of prosperity, which is like,
Oh Lord, yeah, yeah.
let's take it and let's explain why actually God wants you to have lots of other people in debt. And I can just see that the gospel of prosperity would not have fucking flown
No.
in the year 1100. No way.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting too. So Graeber makes this really great point on page 257, which is that debt peonage is far more likely to inspire outrage and collective action than is a system premised on pure inequality. And I think that's really kind of the crux of medieval systems, right? So he says this in the context of discussing the Hindu system in what is now India, and being like, yeah, so we have, you have the varying castes, and then along with that, there's kind of like interest rates, which you're allowed to charge them, and of course, if you're up at the higher end of the castes, it's like you can't charge a Brahmin like very very much at all. Like, well, you can only charge them 2% a month on something, but if you are kind of like down at the lower ends, like if you're a Sudra, it's 5%, right? And this pisses people off, and people hate this, right? And so you basically have like restrictions on usury that end up coming in as a result of this. And no one is saying like, oh, we've got to get rid of the castes, right? Like no one is saying, oh no, we're all fine. But they're like, well, you can't do that. Same thing in European society. Nobody is saying, oh, you've got to get rid of serfdom, but they're saying, yeah, but you can't just take the guy's mill and then make more money on it, right? It's the inequality is sort of accepted as baked into how society is. But when you bring in money, this human invention, that's where you've got problems. Right. And I find it's really interesting kind of like seeing where that split comes in. Right.
So God, the universe, whatever, has made
Mhm.
people different, and this is good, and the great chain of being, et cetera, et cetera. And when you start creating abstract financial instruments to keep yourself at the top of the great chain of being, it seems like maybe that's not the thing God had set up in the first place.
Yeah. And then, in the Confucian context, he brings up the good point that like you have whole ass revolutions over in China as a result of debt, right? Where it's like, like Wang Mang, he does a whole revolution because he's like, you can't just keep taking this much of peasants' harvests, right? Like you can't. So it's like it used to be that about 3% of their harvest would be taken, and it jumps to 50%, and they're like, no, right. So it's not the problem of the peasants, and it's not even the problem of taxing the peasants. It's the problem of being like, this is going up to a percentage which is like it's unable to allow these people to live freely, right? Like, so it's the instrumentalization, she says, rolls off the tongue. It's the instrumentalization of this as a weapon, and like the suffering that it can cause. And this is sort of like agreed upon across the world at the time, that it's not great. And indeed, this is kind of like why you end up seeing what you see in Europe with Jewish people. So there's a big thing with within the Abrahamic religions. Okay, like across the board, everyone kind of agrees that usury, which is lending money at interest, is bad and sinful, right? And the prohibitions against this are read in several many ways. So, like for example, it is considered unchristian. Like a Christian cannot lend money at interest to another Christian. And same thing, like within the Islamic world, although it happens within a merchant context. What are you going to do? But for Jewish people, the way that it is interpreted is that Jewish people aren't supposed to lend money at interest to other Jewish people. And it's sort of like, well, feel free if they aren't Jewish. And then so this basically gets weaponized, especially in Europe, against Jewish people. So for example, here in England, after the Norman conquest, the Normans expressly invite Jewish people into England because they weren't up here because it sucked. And like there were maybe like 3 or 4 Jewish people. There weren't a whole ton. But they get told, hey, you can come up here and you're going to get really great legal rights. So it's like only you would always have to be tried in royal court for whatever because you're under the king's protection. But if you're here, you have to lend money. the thing that you have to do is lend money, and you can't be like, no, I'm going to set up a farm, right? Like Jewish people are not allowed to do that. Um, and so that does a couple of things. Once it gets the economy to sort of tick over, but it also allows the king in particular to then, if he gets tired of being in debt, just do a bunch of violence and do a pogrom. And you'll see this happen over and over again. Is that if local people then get in too much debt, they will just kill the people who lent it to them. And this culminates with the expulsion of the Jews in England when the crown just gets in too much debt. So it's a really interesting thing because they invite the violence of debt, right? And then use violence to then kind of like counsel it out when it suits them. So you have this kind of like constantly marginal population that are forced into this life. And it's bad for everybody involved, right? Much worse for Jewish people, to be clear.
Yeah, I'm really struck by how all of these traditions seem to have, responsibilities that go both ways. I mean, the Confucian tradition does, the Islamic tradition does, the Christian tradition does. And, if someone is not fulfilling those responsibilities, the peasants have a ready-made solution, which is kill them, which is something that we talked about, how the fact that that's not on the table for the current plutocrats is just so befuddling. I'm not advocating killing them, but I'm really surprised that no one is. It's weird.
Yeah. They should be more frightened, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
We could use a little bit of that. And indeed, I was really struck by Graeber writes very eloquently about kind of like the Confucian view of like merchants and money and making and the making of it in this. And it's sort of like the only reason commercial profit should happen is you should only just be compensated by like the travel involved in something. Right. Like, so otherwise you should be buying it from the person who made it. Right. Like the merchant, the middleman shouldn't be able to mark up goods.
Mm-hmm.
The middleman shouldn't be able to say, like, because this is essentially a form of usury, again, just by saying like, you just owe me money because I said so. It's like, all it should be is like, well, yeah, it's very difficult to take a caravan train across the Gobi. So you should be compensated for that. That's fine. And it's anything above that is too much, right? So it's completely fine to compensate someone for, I don't know, a linen coat, let's just say. So something I grabbed out of nowhere. It'd be absolutely fine to say, okay, well, this is what it's worth, and this is what the how much time it took you, and this is what linen is worth. But then if you, I don't know, take it to Venice and try to sell it, you should only be putting it up by the amount of money that it took to get it from there to Venice, right? And anything else would be bad.
Yeah.
And I like that. I think that's a quite handy and interesting way of thinking about commerce, right? So it's like, that's where you make your money, and that's kind of fine, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, that makes sense. And then it seems like the use of the Jewish moneylenders is just this unbelievably bald-faced, legalistic, like, yes, we have these rules against this happening, but whoops-a-daisy, I found a place where the rules don't apply. And that's why I think even to our modern eyes, the culture of usury around the Jewish communities stands out as shocking in a way that, like, what the shit Thomas Aquinas is up to is not shocking in the same way, because there's just no goddamn justification for, within the medieval systems of justifications, the justification for a community of Jewish moneylenders answerable to the king with none of the protections that every religious and cultural tradition says every human being deserves some of these protections. It's I'm out of words. I can't fathom it. I can't fathom it. I can see logic behind medieval Christianity, but not there. Oh my God.
No, it's and that's the thing, is that I think a lot of times medieval Christianity gets a bad rap, and I'm always defending it. And then suddenly something like this will come along and you're like, oh, Jesus Christ, like, what am I supposed to do with this? Right. Like this loophole And I think that a lot of it also comes from the fact that we've got to understand, especially the medieval church, as a bureaucracy. It's a legal juggernaut, and that's the thing that it does. And it takes it until about the 12th century or so to really become that. But once it
Mhm.
does, it's like, okay, here's how the rules work, and they build in loopholes, and it's quite similar to like the way when Graeber talks about how Islamic jurists, because Islam comes out of a mercantile tradition, they have a different kind of view of how commerce works, because the Prophet Muhammad was a merchant, right? And so they're like, okay, well, here the way, yeah, debt's bad, right? That's bad, but what if it was a service fee? Yeah. What if, well, if you're going to buy this on credit, it's 3% higher than it would be if you were just buying it outright. What if? And so there's all these sneaky workarounds, which I find really interesting and very similar, where it's like they know,
Mm.
right? They know that it is not good, but they're like, well, it's not really debt, right? Like it's not really debt. It's a service. I'm giving you a service and I'm charging for the service. So it's these ways of changing the viewpoint in order to allow yourself to do that, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I was really struck by that account of Islam as a merchant tradition. I also, the first time I went to Japan and I took students with me, but also I were just blown away by the markets that were around the
Mm.
Buddhist temples, and it was so fascinating, especially reading that, but learning about the way that there were. It wasn't an attempt. We've got an idea, and it seems like the medieval church didn't truly have this idea, although it somewhat did, that like commerce and religion are incompatible. But it's more like there's rules about commerce
Hmm.
within religion, and then of course king's going to king, bureaucracy is going to bureaucracy, legal system's going to legal system, and they'll find their ways out of it for the great and the good, as
Yeah.
they like to call themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Like there's still going to be this kind of desire for or need for commerce, and it will all sort itself out, but it's just kind of like, well, what are the rules?
Mhm.
How are we setting the boundaries? And there's always going to be this discomfort, like the
Mhm.
moral quandary at the heart of all of this. And it's just sort of like, well, who is able to instrumentalize that and who isn't? Who is able to wield that for their own benefit, and who cannot,
Yeah. Yeah, and that in that respect, that
Mm,
hadn't changed lately.
yeah.
I, we're heading towards the end of our time. I think we covered everything that
I
we
think
talked
we
about
did. Yeah.
covering.
Yeah.
If there's anything else you want to throw out there, I'm game.
Yeah, no, I think that that's pretty much what I wanted to get through. Yeah, like I suppose that one of the things that I would say is that one way to kind of think about the process of the Middle Ages is also across Afro Eurasia, a process of kind of like allowing merchants and the people who operate within these systems to rise to the top of society, and that being seen
Ah,
as fine,
yeah.
right? So within the Islamic context, it's like that. It's a little chiller because again of who our boy Muhammad was. So it's a little bit more like, oh, these could be a cultural elite, and a merchant could be that, right? And same thing in China. There's this process of the erosion of worries about what that is as you get towards the modern period, and the acceptance of people kind of amassing wealth in this way. And certainly again, like that's how we define the Renaissance in Europe. Is no, it's absolutely fine to be a banker now, like, oh, that's a nice house you got there, right? And this rich people being able to acquire money in this way, and enjoy life in a way that we would ordinarily see had been reserved for nobles or kings, right? And in a way, like the capitalist reading of this is, and that's a good thing, right? And that's a good thing because, oh, they're not the church or royalty. They're private citizens, and they have this much money, and that's therefore good. And I would say actually what this is an expansion of the violence of that.
Yeah.
And who is able, like, so it's an expansion of licit violence. right? So we go from seeing that the crown can, you know, have, you know, a violence to it, and religious institutions, you know, as can call for violence. And what this is saying that there are private individuals who can do violence by means of debt, and that is also acceptable. And that is
Not just acceptable, good. There's
good. Yeah, good.
you've expressed over and over again, all of these traditions have this tension around
Hmm.
the violence the king can do, the church can do, baked within those traditions. And people believed in this shit, and kings got
Hmm.
worried that they were going to hell, which I mean,
Oh
then they
yeah,
started
yeah, yeah.
killing Jews or Muslims or something. So maybe I don't like their solutions, but that shows they
Right.
were actually worried that what
Hmm.
they were doing was bad. And the merchants are like, not only is what I'm doing not bad, what I'm doing is the best thing. And this is where you get
Hmm.
Adam Smith's song of praise for the merchant. And the difference between a commerce-based system where commerce is what it is that there's that taint, that fear of doing something wrong, because we know we have to do commerce, but we also know that Jesus or Buddha or whoever was suspicious of commerce. When the merchants
Hmm.
start running, it's like, we know we have to do commerce.
Mm.
End of story. That's worse.
Yeah, and I suppose that what I would say about the Middle Ages, and one of the things that we should bring back, you know, at the very least, you know, rich people being frightened, that'd be good. But also feeling some fucking shame about it.
Shame. Yeah.
You know, like the shame gets a bad rap, you know, like I think that shame around sex is probably bad, but I think shame around like impoverishing your fellow man for your own, you know, benefit. We should bring that back, because at least medieval people felt ashamed of it. At least they were like, no, it's a service charge. You know, like at least they
Yeah.
would feel bad. Like bring back shame.
I promise I'm gonna light so many
Oh
candles,
my God, I'm
like,
gonna, yeah, the incense is gonna be off the hook, right?
at least
Just,
at least at least I'm lighting that as a sign that I know I'm doing something wrong. And that we've lost that. We have
mm,
lost that. And you can think of Occupy Wall Street as the great expression of, you should be, if the Tea Party says, if you are in debt, you should be ashamed of yourself. Occupy Wall Street was a clarion call. If you are running the world this way, you
you
should
should
be
be
ashamed.
ashamed. Absolutely.
And that's why they had to kill it.
Mm, mm.
Probably because they were ashamed. I
Yeah,
mean, they
probably
were
they were.
ashamed.
It probably worked. You know, I think that a lot of people, if they look deep inside their hearts, and you know, this is why we have to keep the Middle Ages at arm's length.
Yeah.
You know, this is why we have to say that the Middle Ages is a bad time, because there's these really useful things that call into question our entire society and how it's run. So you've got to say it was bad, right? No.
Yeah. Fantastic. Damn it, we've got to talk about farts. That'll have to be for another time.
Ah, absolutely.
Eleanor, thank you so much. Thank you for kicking this whole series off. Thank you for coming back. This is just a thrill.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Couldn't think of a better thing to be doing with my afternoon.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you.